Hi everyone, this is the second part of week four's lectures on Descartes and Spinoza. And for this video, we're going to start finally digging into Spinoza. Now, Spinoza, or was rather, a Jewish philosopher. He was part of sort of like a Portuguese Jewish community in Amsterdam. And ultimately, Spinoza is very interesting because he uses a lot of the resources that we end up finding in Descartes, like Descartes' account of substance, right? And various other related concepts, and we'll see that in more depth in just a moment, to sort of build up a philosophical system that is in many ways anti-Cartesian. Really, what I mean by that is that Spinoza is very influenced by Cartesian rationalism, right? This idea that the surest path to sort of finding the foundations of our knowledge is to hold on to those clear and distinct ideas, right? And really, the model for clear and distinct ideas are concepts in geometry, right? And here they're really influenced by Euclid's elements, right? This serves as sort of like the pinnacle form of knowledge. Why? Because whenever you have an adequate, definition of a triangle or a circle or something to that effect, then you can know all the possible modifications that that shape can undergo and still remain that shape, right? And this is sort of knowledge that's perfect because it doesn't ever change, right? It's not contingent, it's not based on our finite, sense capacities, right? That just is what, a triangle or a square or a circle or whatever simply is, right? And you can know with clarity, so you know exactly the thing that the definition is signifying, and you know with distinctness, you know the exact moment when that geometric shape is no longer a square or a circle or a triangle and so on, right? And so for both Descartes and Spinoza, this sort of model of our knowledge needs to be guided by clear and distinct ideas, right? That these serve as the foundation for our knowledge, and that we can know these through just sort of like pure rational insight, right? This is ultimately what Spinoza shares in common with Descartes, right? And early on, Spinoza sort of fashions himself as a Cartesian. He attempts to sort of rewrite elements of Descartes' philosophical system, but ordered according to what he calls a geometrical mode of presentation. So what that means is that, and we're going to see this whenever we read the Ethics by Spinoza, which we're going to be doing for the next couple of weeks, is we see that the work is really divided into axioms, definitions, and propositions, where axioms are, the most foundational sort of like parts of the system, and then definitions maybe, explain how a term is used in one of the axioms, right? And then you can derive all of the implications from those axioms, right? And so this is sort of like the way that Spinoza sort of envisions like rewriting the Cartesian system. It's like, okay, well, we're going to begin with the most axiomatic features of Descartes' analysis, and then we're going to move to, the particular propositions, right? And so, for example, I know from the cogito, right, that I am a thinking thing. Right. And so the fact that I'm a thinking thing is like a proposition that we could derive from an axiom, right? And so Spinoza is in many respects sort of like doubling down on Descartes' emphasis on mathematics and especially geometry as sort of like a pinnacle for knowledge. And remember, keep in mind, like Descartes himself invents analytic geometry, right? And so you're seeing major strides in geometry as, an important kind of knowledge, right? And that the sort of mathematical approach to nature is absolutely central to the development of experimental and mathematical sciences that you see in Copernicus, Galileo, and so on, that really characterize this period. And Descartes himself is part of that same tradition, right? So this is a very modern enterprise, right? We're going to try to know everything with the same sort of certainty that we gain from mathematical approaches to knowledge. Now, but if we are meant to proceed by clear and distinct ideas, right? Distinctness is a criterion of those ideas. We need to know, the separation from one concept to another concept, and this is vitally important, right? And this is, I think, one way of understanding Spinoza's intervention into rationalism during this period is, as we discussed in the last video, Descartes in the Principles of Philosophy just kind of virtually admits that he equivocates on the idea of substance, right? That he uses the same word substance to refer to God, who is the absolute substance, right? And then individual bodies and minds that are the finite substances, right? And he's like, yeah, I use the word substance for both of these. But, ultimately, God is the only real substance, and everything finite is a modification of God. It depends on God, right? And since substance defines a dependence relationship, right, then God is the absolute substance. And all of the particular things that we think about as being bodies and minds and so on, all of those are modifications of God. And so this is going to be like the very sort of like broad overview of what sort of Spinoza's philosophy is like, is sort of taking this insight of like, okay, well, there is, God as substance, and then there are modifications of God that are the particular, finite bodies and minds that I happen to, investigate. And so what if we rewrote Descartes' system, being very precise about this, right? No longer simply accepting the method in the meditations, which, as many of you pointed out in your discussion post, is very casual in some respects. Descartes is sort of like just kind of like listing his own thoughts as they come, and he describes like sitting by the fire, all this kind of stuff, just sort of sitting there and engaging in a skeptical doubt or whatever, right? And so it has a very like, we'll tackle problems as they go. It's not very systematic, right? It's very spontaneous, right, in that respect. And Spinoza is going to eliminate as much of that as possible to make it as rigorous and exact a philosophical system as it can possibly be. And the ethics really is, I think, the pinnacle in many respects of the rationalist tradition, simply because he really does attempt to build a philosophical system in the model of Euclid's ethics, and of course also Descartes' own geometry, right? Okay, and so what's interesting about this conception is like, Spinoza starts to think about God as the sole substance of the world, and all of the finite things being only modifications of God, right? And this results in some very heterodox religious beliefs, right? So, I mean, one example of that, something that you're going to be reading in the Ethics, is that Spinoza at one point says, Deus sive natura. Um, and what that means, Deus is God, sive is like or, and then natura is nature. So, in other words, for Spinoza breaks really fundamentally and radically, both with the Christian tradition that Descartes was in and the Judaic tradition that was part of the Jewish, religious community that he was a part of for a very long period of his life, right? And so to say God or nature, Deus sive natura, is to say that for Spinoza, it's indifferent whether you talk about God or you talk about nature. You can do either, right? God is not like, sort of like you imagine in Descartes, like sort of like the big bearded man in the sky, or whatever sort of image that you have, right? Where there's God on the one hand and then there's God's creation on the other, right? And God always exists, right? But the creation enters at a specific moment in time, right? And so God is like a person for Descartes, right? God exhibits volition. God decides on things, right? Whereas for Spinoza, God is an impersonal entity. God just is the universe. It just is this, the sum total sort of everything, right? Or the substantial basis of everything. And, we're going to obviously have to fill in this picture a lot more and make it a lot more detailed in order to make it philosophically satisfying, right? But this is sort of the image that Spinoza has of the universe, is that, there's not really like a God. God doesn't exhibit the feature of omnibenevolence for Spinoza, right? If God just is the universe, right, then uh, natural disasters, earthquakes, right, all of this sort of stuff, that's as much a part of God's creation as human beings are, right? And so human beings are not created in God's image, right? For Spinoza, that's just sort of a projection that human beings make about God. And we make it out of weakness. Like, we would really like it if God resembled us in all these various ways, right? And so we just simply imagine that he does, right? And so a lot of what Spinoza is up to is trying to sort of weed out this wishful thinking about the existence of God that stems from us insofar as we're finite agents, like we can be killed, and so we hope that the universe is set up in a way that, reflects our own nature and, is teleologically ordered. So it's ordered with purpose, right? The idea that like God created the earth like for us, right? Spinoza is trying to dispense with all of these ideas. No, 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 that's not the nature of God. That's something that you believe because you're superstitious, right? That's sort of the ethos of a lot of what Spinoza has to say about these sort of questions, right? And so obviously this grates a whole lot against existing religious institutions, right? It's sort of a radical extension of this Copernican idea that the universe does not sort of like reflect human interests, right? It's sort of like wounding our human narcissism, right? To say that the universe and God is not just like a reflection of certain features about human beings, right? God is, for Spinoza, the sole substance of the universe. And the way to know about God is not through the religious texts or anything like that, or at least not primarily through religious texts, but primarily through science and philosophy. That if you want to know about God, that's the way that you do it. You learn about either, God as the substance of things by doing philosophy, or you learn about how God expresses him, her, they, self, right, themself, through its modifications. And that's what you discover with natural science, right? And so you're seeing a real cut against religious authority and for philosophy and science, right, as independent ways of knowing about God that don't need to be mediated through religious institutions at all. And so Spinoza plays a very important role in sort of the narrative of early modern philosophy, precisely because he's so heterodox, right? He has, at least it seems, some religious commitments, like he talks about the existence of God, right? But at the end of the day, it becomes very difficult to separate out like the extent to which, like, is Spinoza an atheist? Is he agnostic? Is he, a true religious believer? Like, how should we characterize Spinoza's religious beliefs? That's going to be a question that we, address together over the next coming weeks. But just to give you a little bit more biographical information before we go into the material itself, right? Spinoza was excommunicated from his synagogue, right? And the reason why he was excommunicated is because of his philosophical beliefs, right? I once had the experience of, there was a Spinoza expert. His name is Stephen Nadler, and he came to UNM actually. I think like in 2015ish or something like that. Anyway, I was able to see him talk, and he read off, some official documents. He read off, like, for example, one punishment that another synagogue goer received for punching a rabbi in the face. And it was like, hey, you need to pray, you need to, ask for forgiveness and come back to the synagogue in a week, right? Okay, not that harsh of a sentence, right? And then he read Spinoza's Excommunication, which you can look up online. In previous classes, I actually read the whole thing out, but it's kind of wordy. But essentially, what it says is, uh, damn Spinoza for all eternity. Damn anyone who would read his books. Damn anyone who would house him or aid him or give him food. Damn him in the day. Damn him in the night. Damn him with all of the curses of the Holy Book. And he can never be a part of this religious community ever again. And he's excommunicated. Anybody that reads him is excommunicated. Yeah. you know so like they saw it as a big deal, right? And then, part of the explanation for why it's such a big deal, I mean, one, yes, it is all the things that Spinoza says about God, right? But then two, some people interpret Spinoza as sort of denying the possibility of human beings having a soul, right? Because Spinoza says, hey, God is not a lawbringer. God is not sort of like a judge looking over the world and evaluating people's actions, right? And so you sort of don't really get a scheme with heaven or hell or responsibility for your mortal deeds in the afterlife, right? And this is what is always like really threatening, right? Because it has sort of like an immediate social and political consequence, right? Um, So yeah, I mean, he was excommunicated from his synagogue. He then was a lens grinder. He was offered a position at the University of Heidelberg, which some students might know. Hegel actually occupied that chair eventually, which is very interesting. But he turned it down because he knew that he would get censored at that university, which is probably a good bet. Um, and he eventually died from like inhaling shards of glass from being a lens grinder. So yeah, but all in all, he was pretty happy being excommunicated. Like it's kind of interesting. Hopefully, this isn't too much story time, but recently, that very same synagogue has sort of like revisited this. There was an inquiry, I think it was, 5 or so years ago, that Stephen Nadler guy was telling us about it, where they reached out to like 5 people, some Spinoza experts, some rabbis, right? And being like, hey, should we reverse essentially, the synagogue's decision on Spinoza, right? Uh, the answer that they came to was no. Right? And the reason why not, in part, was because, like, from the religious tradition angle, it's like, well, if rabbis really have the ability to issue out these sort of like eternal religious condemnations, then overturning it at a later point right? Like it really sort of takes away from that, right? But then on the other hand, what Stephen Adler said that he told them, for example, was like, well, no, like Spinoza was ultimately not very sad about being excommunicated. He didn't really belong there anyway. So yeah, why reverse it? You know, why do that now? Anyway, I just thought that was interesting. And recently, like this other Spinoza expert tried to like film a documentary and do it in part on their property, and they sent out this letter to him that was like, no, and also you're not welcome here, you know, for being involved, right? Um, I think there were some further developments in that story that I don't want to, keep things going for too long on that before we can get into content. Um, but yeah, so that's just to say that people are still fired up about this kind of stuff. And it's very interesting to see that, like, the political debates that were happening in the 17th century continue to now, you know? Okay. So let's start to get into some of the major distinctions on this text. So these two texts are things that I think are helpful for giving an introduction to Spinoza, because if we just try to dive into the ethics, it's going to be very difficult, right? And it's going to be very challenging over the next few weeks. That's just the reality of this material. But we're going to try to get through it and make it make as much sense as we possibly can. And I'll try to be responsive to people's questions in the discussion board. Okay, so two texts we're going to be discussing. The first is the letter on the infinite. Here's a quote from, I think it's only in the second page or something like that, of the letter. Today we're going to focus a lot on the distinction between essence and existence, right? The essence of something refers to its fundamental nature, right? And the existence of something refers to the contingent fact of whether or not it exists. So essences are necessary and existences are contingent, right? They could be otherwise. And so really figuring out this distinction is going to be absolutely central for understanding basically all of the rationalists, right? I mean, we've already encountered this distinction at one point in the ontological argument, right? Where it's in God's essence to exist, right? So for God, essence and existence are the same, right? And a lot of Spinoza's insights are going to be centered on this observation. So Spinoza says here, quote, and this just says letter on the infinite, right? This is the text that we're discussing. So this text says, quote, the question of the infinite has universally been found to be very difficult, indeed insoluble, through a failure to distinguish between, and then he lists two different senses of infinity. So in other words, like the problem with the infinite is that the infinite seems to bear all of these sort of like contradictory features about it, right? Like is the infinite divisible or not, right? Well, it seems like it's made of numbers. Numbers are divisible, right? But if you think about like God as being an infinite thing, it doesn't really make sense to say that there are parts of God, right? If there are parts of God, then those parts would be more fundamental than God, right? Um, and so God wouldn't really be God in that case, right? So the infinite seems like it has these features that like are in contradiction with one another, right? And Spinoza is going to try to resolve this by distinguishing between two different senses of the infinite. There's number one, that which must be infinite by its very nature, or by virtue of his definition. These two he takes to be the same thing, right? So for something to be infinite by its very nature means that, it's not finite. It does not depend on anything else, right? Similarly, like when you think about the ontological argument, like modes or particulars, you and I, right, we come into existence at a particular point in time, right? We're born. And then something bigger than us can come and squish us, right? And so we die, right? Or our bodies fall apart on their own, right? Um, and so it's not in our very nature to exist, right? We exist only by virtue of other contingent things, right? Like, your parents or whatever process, you were born, right? You were born. And so um, what that means is that you are not infinite by virtue of your very nature. You are finite, right? You're created by something else. You come into existence at a particular point in time and you exit at another point in time, right? And so the second one refers to those sort of things like you, right? If you're not infinite, right, then you are, or not absolutely infinite, right, then we can also think about a different kind of infinity that is infinite not by virtue of its essence but by virtue of its cause, right? And so what Spinoza is trying to distinguish here is, like, on the one hand there's God's infinity, right? That fits the first definition. That's why I've written God here in blue. But on the other hand, there's the infinity that exists among modes or among modifications of God, or, as I've written here in blue, creation, right? So, like, think about the universe, right? You can think about the universe as being, like, infinitely large, and you can also think about God potentially making the universe bigger, right? God could, in the same way that, and for now, we'll keep sort of like the Christian imagery about God as someone who decides to do something, right? But later we're going to complicate that. But for now, we can think about, like, if you're a Cartesian or something like that, like God created the universe is infinite, right? There's the infinitely small domain, there's the infinitely large domain, right? There's a certain infinity that belongs to creation, right? But God could double it, right? Could triple it, could quadruple it, right? Could cut it in half, right? And so this kind of infinity admits of division, right? That's why I've written here mode and duration. So in other words, like, even though the universe is infinite, right, it also comes into existence at a certain point in time, right? And the reason why it's infinite is in virtue of its cause, namely God, right? God causes this kind of divisible infinity, right? But God is him, her, themselves, not caused by anything else, right? That's just what it means to be God. And we're going to see that in the ethics, but it also is sort of implicit in the ontological argument, right? God's existence comes from God's own essence, right? And so this is not divisible, right? They're not parts of God. There cannot be two gods. There cannot be half of a God, right? From Spinoza's conception. And this is the ontological argument is the basis of a lot of, like, monotheistic insights, right? And so, of course, it's true that not everyone agrees with that as a framework, but, we're just trying to inhabit their point of view, right? And from this point of view, like, God is absolute in the sense that everything ultimately depends on God, right? God God's existence is authorized solely through God, him, her, them, self, right? Whereas our existence is caused by other things, right? And so this is crucially important. Modes, which I've written in red here, corresponding to the number 2, they have a certain duration, right? They exist for a certain determinate amount of time, right? Whereas God is substance and is eternal, right? God always exists, since, not caused by anything else. So this is the picture that we get on the letter on the infinite, and we're starting to get something like a substance mode distinction. And we can see how both substance and mode can both be infinite, but infinite in different ways, right? One admits of divisibility and the other does not, right? One is infinite by virtue of its essence, one is infinite by virtue of its cause, right? So one is necessarily infinite and one is contingently infinite. And those are importantly distinct from one another if we're trying to understand what Spinoza's up to. Next, I want to briefly talk about the Treatise on the Emendation of the Intellect, and I'll try not to go too long here. But essentially, this is Spinoza trying to rewrite the Discourse on Method, which is sort of like an early version of the Meditations, or you can think of it as him trying to rewrite the Meditations, right? How do we come to know things, right? How can I live a life that I know for certain is good? These are the sort of questions that animate this sort of treatise. And Spinoza locates four different sources of our knowledge, right? So here we're just reading Treatise on the Emendation of the Intellect. And then here I have a list of four different sources of knowledge. They are written from the top is the weakest source of knowledge, and the bottom is the strongest source of knowledge. So divided into two different colors. The first two I've written in this black because they are knowledge. Oh, I'm sorry, I've written this backwards. This should say. The first two categories are knowledge of existence, and the latter two categories are knowledge of essence. Now, so if we consider them one by one, testimony, right? So this is just when someone else tells me something. I know it by hearsay, right? And Spinoza's example of this is the date of my birth, right? I don't have any memories of the date of my birth. I solely rely on the testimony of others, my parents, doctors, whoever, to tell me when that was, right? And so in addition to all the problems that we're going to talk about with ordinary perception, it also has the problem of, well, people could be lying to you, they could themselves be mistaken, right? There are all sort of epistemic problems that come with testimony or opinion or hearsay or gossip, right? They could be wrong, they could be lying, all that kind of stuff, right? And then you have perception. This is when I see things myself, right? So like I see today that it's snowing a lot, right? And so this has a lot of limitations as well, right? All the problems with sense perception that we've been talking about the last couple of weeks, right? And perception here, he means sensory perception. So ordinary kinds of perceptions, like something's in front of me, this phone, I see it, right? I can touch it, right? I can process that information, right? Now, importantly, Descartes distinguishes between reason and intuition. And importantly, you want to think about this intuition not in the case of like ordinary sense perception, but as a kind of intellectual intuition. What does that mean? So reason, Spinoza thinks, is knowledge that you get through inferences, right? So it's like, because I know that the premises are true, I can know that the conclusion is true, right? This is the sort of knowledge. These are conditional, right? Conditional judgments. If this is true, then this is true, right? And so this is why reason is a very strong form of knowledge, right? It's stronger than testimony, it's stronger than perception. It gives you knowledge into the essence or nature of things, right? But because its sort of paradigmatic operation is as a conditional, right? it relies on something else being true, right? And here you might think about like mathematical kinds of knowledge, right? And this is the sort of thing that Descartes could still doubt with the evil demon, right? It's like, if I've calculated correctly, then, 1087 times 52 is whatever, right? And so you assume that you've done the calculation correctly, and then you say what follows from that on the assumption that you have calculated correctly, right? And so that's why this is a kind of conditional judgment. But now intuition, or intellectual intuition, this is where Spinoza thinks that you get clear and distinct ideas, whereas he's going to say adequate ideas, right? And what he has in mind is, like we were saying earlier, geometrical definitions, right? With geometrical definitions, it's not just that, like, you could know something, right? It's that you do know it, right? And that's what's kind of weird about it, is that it involves a kind of intuition. Like, obviously with Descartes' analytic geometry, you can like chart out shapes on a Cartesian coordinate plane, right? And you drawing it is just sort of like a physical representation of what's going on at an intellectual level, right? And so for Spinoza thinks that whenever you have an intellectual intuition about something, you know it and you know the implications of it, right? And so example here would be, I think, the cogito, right? The cogito is an immediate kind of knowledge, right? It's like you know that you exist not by virtue of an inference from something else, right? But simply because you understand what it means to doubt something, right? Knowing what it means to doubt something just is knowing what it means to think, which just is knowing that you exist, right? There's no like additional reflection necessary, right? It's an immediate kind of knowledge, right? And so this is what Spinoza conceives of as adequate ideas, where it's you perceive the essence of something and then you can know its downstream consequences. So it's like, because I have the perfect definition of a circle or a triangle or whatever in Euclid, then I can also know all of the different permutations that you can have on that triangle or square or circle or whatever, right? The mode where the existence of the thing corresponds to its essence, right? And what these geometrical definitions let us do is know the essence of something absolutely perfectly, right? Such that we can know all of the instances or cases, right? In the same way that like knowing 2 plus 2 equals 4 allows you to utilize that in all cases where there are 2 plus 2 plus 4, right? It could be, 2 headbands or 2 pens or 2 notebooks or whatever, right? In all of those cases, you can use the arithmetic knowledge that 2 plus 2 equals 4, right? Okay. So this is why with testimony and perception, you get knowledge of existence. You know particular things, right? You see particular things, or someone tells you about a particular thing, and so on. But with these, you get at sort of like the essence or fundamental nature of reality, right? And then when you understand them, you know what it means to understand them, right? And so this is why there's a sort of reflexivity to this kind of knowledge. To know it is to know that you know it, right? So like if I know 2 plus 2 equals 4, it's not that I haphazardly guess that 2 plus 2 equals 4. It's because I know exactly what 2 and 4 and the operation of addition means, right? And so that's why I can use that knowledge in other contexts as well, right? I know the rule for what it means to add things, right? And so the knowledge that 2 plus 2 equals 4 is also the knowledge for how to apply that operation generally, right? And so my knowledge of its essence allows a wide knowledge of how it can exist in particular cases. Okay, I'm sorry that we've gone so long. Um, I appreciate y'all. I just want to try to do as much as I can to adequately prepare you for the ethics next week because it is quite a difficult text. We're going to be talking about part one together, and then the following week we're going to have Kevin Lower come and talk with me about part two of the ethics, and those are going to be the only parts that we read for this course. So I hope that this has been helpful. I look forward to seeing your responses on the discussion board. Thanks. Have a nice week.